Hi, this is Nick Harding here with our TFH Leadership Conversation, and I am delighted to have Martin Dickson with me today, who is a very good friend I've known for many years. Martin's currently working for Safe Families. But before we get into that, Martin, I'd like to, first of all, welcome you to the today's recording.
Thank you, Nick. Good to be with you.
And good to be with you too. So Martin, one of the questions we nearly always start with is just, how did you come to faith? What brought you into faith before you came into Christian ministry?
I had an upbringing in faith. My parents lived by faith. We were members of our local church. But it was always at arm's length for me. My parents were clearly absolutely devoted and passionate about their faith. And that had a huge impact on our family growing up. Looking back, I'm deeply grateful to them for the way they brought us up in that faith, but going through it at the time was tough and difficult. I was far less convinced than they were about what was going on. I've always believed there was a God. I've always believed that something had created something. I think looking back, I was always convinced that there was Jesus, but was it personally? It really wasn't. It was something that my parents were all about. I had a real encounter with God kind of in my late teenage years, where God really showed up and made a big impact, miraculous impact actually, and did some things that no one else could have done, and that radically transformed the whole trajectory of my life going forward. I'll spare you the long details of that, but God is good and showed his goodness to me, and I just wanted more of it. It took me on a kind of an exciting roller coaster ride of all sorts of experiences that I just never would have had without God's guidance and Jesus' love, really. So yeah, that's the short version of a long story.
Yeah, many people who grow up in a Christian home have a sort of kind of a love-hate relationship with that experience, partly because sometimes there are constraints and restrictions, sometimes, but also because of the example that you've been given. And, I know your mum and dad, and I know what a great example of faith they are and have been to you. And although there must have been challenges with that, I think it must have been very inspiring to watch God growing up provide for your family.
Well, what they showed to us allowed me to, I suppose it gave me the foundation to make some decisions that perhaps we'll talk about further on. They made some decisions that perhaps people would find difficult to understand, almost easy for me, because I'd seen God show up in the miraculous so many times. It was just never personalized for me until God did it in my own life.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Wonderful. And so you left school, you ended up working for a furniture company and Liverpool City Council, I think. What was all that about?
Left school at 16, went to college to study engineering for the only reason it was the only thing I had any slight interest in. I didn't particularly enjoy school, came out with some fairly mediocre results because this didn't engage me at all. Left college and went to university and discovered in an engineering degree that the college had woefully underprepared us. It was shut down and demolished actually, not as a result, but certainly as part of the situation they were in. And so it failed everything in the 6 months. It was disastrous, really. I'd never been excelling in education. I'd always been mediocre. But going off to university, I was in a bad place. And that is where God really showed up. I kind of got really upset with it, really, and really started to struggle and started to really question lots of things about life and where life was going, what the purpose of it all was, and prayed into that. And it was the first time in a long time I'd really prayed seriously, God, I need you to show up in this situation because I've got nothing in my hand. And God really did show up overnight. I'll tell you what happened. The director in the furniture company, Dams International, probably designed the desk you're sitting at, Nick. So I've been around since, actually. I've seen little dams desks all over the country that we were part of designing. Director of it called and said, listen, I've got a job going. I don't know if you're interested, but I've always wanted to pay me favour to your dad. He gave me a car years ago. Turned out I was our next door neighbour from when I was a kid.
Wow.
And he had a job, but he needed a specific qualification. And I had the qualification. I'd done it alongside my studies in college. They'd offered us this extra additional course for anyone who wanted to do it in computer-aided design. And I'd done it. And I had the job and I started within a week.
Amazing.
Designing offices all over the country, yeah. So, yeah. And then from there into Liverpool City Council.
What did you do for them?
I worked in an engineering consultancy that was attached to the council, who were basically traffic engineers. And I worked with the city engineers to design road traffic junctions.
So you're to blame for the terrible state of our road situation.
I take no responsibility. I just did as I was told. I'm possibly responsible for some of the people who've got parking tickets for parking on double yellow lines. Liverpool City Council. This is part of my journey into the next phase of life. Liverpool City Council lost some of their double yellow lines, and unless you know where they are, you can't prosecute anybody for them. But part of my job once a week was to go and find double yellow lines and draw them on a map. So we could prosecute people for parking on them.
Wow, that must have made you really popular with your friends and family.
I despise that part of the role, I have to say.
So where does, at some point along the journey, you met Jo, your wife, and you've had a family. Just tell us a little bit about that, Martin.
So I was a member at Oasis Church in Wallasey, and I was involved in the youth work there. And Jo came as a year out volunteer. She'd studied a degree up at with the Elam Barber College, and come to do a year, and we just got involved in the youth work together, and went from kind of slight dislike of each other into being forced to work together, into falling in love, and then getting married, and here we are, kind of what best part of 20 years later with 3 kids.
Yeah, brilliant. And so presumably you grew up on the Wirral. Yeah,
Wallasey, whole life. Yeah. We had 3 years out when I lived in Birmingham, when I part of my work with YFC. But yeah, Wallasey the whole time.
So tell us about the journey from normal secular paid work into ministry and how that all took place.
So I'm out one day with the wheels that the engineers have in the street, kind of measuring wheels. I'm out with one of them one day, and looking for double yellow lines on Queen's Drive in Liverpool. And a couple of lads rode up, young lads on bikes. Hey, mate, what are you doing with that wheel? And we had this conversation. And just in that, I had this real moment with God. I don't know if Nick, you on Kairos, I had one of those Kairos moments, where time just stands still for a moment. Something happens. And I just had this really clear sense from God that I had more to offer these kids than telling them what I was doing with a wheel on Queen's Drive. That there was more to this. And was reminded of a number of things that I'd promised to God and God had promised to me in the meantime, since that kind of going to college and going to uni and God showing up there. Some weeks after I'd made that decision and God had moved in my life, I was at a youth event in Liverpool. It was called YP2. It was to do with the MCYC camps. And I remember the band playing Heal Our Nation on one occasion. And people would sat down while the band were playing. I felt really strongly that God was calling me to stand up. It was like, if you mean this, if you want me to heal your nation, you want to be part of it, I want you to stand up. And there was no way I was going to stand up. 200 other people sat down, stand up. And I thought, it's not really God, this is nonsense. And didn't stand up. And the band finished. I was like, oh, that's a relief. It clearly wasn't what God was saying. And then the guy leading said, I just feel somebody needs to make an agreement with God or something along those lines. I think we should play this song again. And I knew. I said, oh my word. So we started to play and I stood up and lots of people laughed at me. But something happened. I felt it in my spirit. It was so acutely aware that something had happened in heaven, kind of thing. It made a difference. And I knew then that there was going to be some something going on in further life. So on that street with that wheel, it was the same sense, like God's in this conversation. I need to be doing something else. And so I went away and started to pray into this, and ended up leaving the council and started a degree in theology. When I left that engineering degree and got the job, I felt at the time God said, "You'll get a degree one day." But I didn't know what. I thought I'd go back to engineering. Anyway, I started this theology degree with a view to going into teaching. So what I thought God was saying was, "You don't want to be teaching about the wheel. I've got something else for you to teach." So I'll go and do this instead. So start a theology degree. In the summer of the second year, I got appendicitis and it was misdiagnosed for 10 days. It gave me gangrene and peritonitis and left me with about 6 hours left to live.
Wow.
And that was a shocking moment. But something really special happened. There was I was in the hospital bed and two people, I can't even remember who they are. I don't think I know who they are. They came to me and said, you had 6 hours left to live. We've come to tell you that God saved your life for a purpose.
Wow.
And they started to describe what that purpose was. And I don't recall ever seeing those people before. I don't recall ever seeing them again since. I don't know who came to the bed. Somebody came to the bed and gave me some deeply personal promises that I've not shared with anybody. And God is working those out as we go. So where does that get to? Starting with YFC. So I went back, did the final year, ended up coming out with how this happens, I've no idea. I came out with a first-class degree in theology.
Amazing.
And was offered a doctorate. So you can come and do a paid doctorate. We'll pay you to do PGCE. Or YFC were in touch locally and said, fancy coming and doing a couple of years with us. So we prayed into it. Joe and I were just about to get married. We prayed and we chose YFC. So I was 25 years old at the time. I'd just come out of uni with a first-class degree and took on a job. I think I was earning £11,000 a year, trying to start a family on it, living in Bevington. But God was so faithful to us throughout all of it. So that led me into...
YFC, obviously, for anyone who doesn't know, is Youth for Christ.
Apologies, yeah. So I was working for Wirral Youth for Christ. Committed 2 years and stayed, 13 if my maths is right.
So, wow.
Yeah.
That must have been quite an adventure, and I guess there were a lot of steps of faith along the way there for you, Martin.
I mean, it was an incredible adventure. There were some incredible privileges with it.
Is there a particular standout moment when God came through when it looked like an impossible situation?
Oh, it happened every month. It happened every month to the point where we almost became immune to it, I suppose. It became so clear that God was going to come through that it didn't even feel like he was coming through anymore. We just lived in that,
this is in terms of your finances, presumably.
Well, yeah, finances particularly, but lots of other things as well. Just when we needed breakthrough to be able to achieve what we felt God was calling us to. Finances was where it was most obvious. So we were hand to mouth for many years. In the third week of every month, there was never enough money to pay the bills in the next week. And the expected income didn't cover the expected outcome. And it happened every month. And yet God always came through. We never missed a payment, never missed a single payment. It was tight, but we never missed a payment. But there were moments where we needed breakthrough. We felt God was calling us to do something or get about something, and there was no possible way of doing it. And we had some incredibly faithful supporters, supporting us financially. Lots of people giving just £5 a month really helped us at times. But there were people praying as well, and we put this prayer point out, and people would begin to pray, really intercess for us, and we'd see the breakthrough. It was incredible.
Amazing.
There was some incredible privilege as well in it. I met the King. I wasn't the King when I met him, but I've been to Clarence House and met the King as part of my job with YFC.
Wow.
So yeah, amazing stuff like that.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah.
And what were the sort of the highlights in terms of what you were able to achieve through Youth for Christ? What were the things you feel most excited about, proud of, or thankful to God for?
It's funny looking back, because there's times when we felt we were doing some amazing stuff because lots of work was happening. But looking back, there was times when it didn't feel like lots of work, but God was really doing it. It's the juxtaposition of those two things. What felt like success at times, looking back, wasn't as successful as the moments where God was just doing something special. So we did lots and lots of schools work. We did lots and lots of proclamational evangelism. We told lots and lots of kids about Jesus and God's love for them, and that was special. I think whenever you speak well of Jesus, God loves that and honors that. But then when we really started to see breakthrough was when we started to impact kind of the real life situations the young people were going through. So when we started to kind of, I suppose, when we started to deal with the issues that people were facing and put the gospel into the context of that, so instead of just kind of jumping on a stage and doing a mad assembly, loads of games, and then talking about God's love and the death and resurrection of Jesus, when we started to deal perhaps with some drug and alcohol abuse, some of the relationship stuff that was going on. Zoe Abernethy, my colleague at the time, started to make a department that was all focused around that. And when we started to get into that stuff, that's when we started to see real impact on people's lives. There's some great memories of that, some real powerful stuff. One of the big moments was we ran an awards night for young people. I took a group out to India. When we were out there, the riots happened in the UK. The Telugu newspaper, the Telugu language newspapers, was translated to us. We saw all this stuff happening. There was photos of London and London on fire. And I asked the guy in the marketplace, please, could you tell me what's happening back at home? He picked up the newspaper, he looked at it, he said, and he ran his finger along it. And what he was actually describing was riots. But the way he worded it, he said, the young people of Great Britain are revolting. And it just really stuck with me, because I was out in India with this group of 15 young people who'd saved a fortune to take it to these kids in India in the slums. They weren't revolting. When we got back, the press were saying that the young people of Great Britain were revolting. There was a real disparaging tone about the nation at the moment in terms of young people, and I wanted to retell that story. So we started Youth Heroes Awards. We won an award in Parliament for it, putting the great stories of young people in the press. The Daily Leveson inquiry about press and the press standards was being debated in the House. I was in there winning an award on behalf of Safe Families for putting great stories about young people in the press.
Do you mean Safe Families or Youth for Christ?
YFC, yeah, Youth for Christ. Sorry, Nick. Yeah. So, only God could do that.
No, it is amazing, and as you say, God does stuff that we could, more than we could ask, think, or imagine. So often, it's fantastic. Now, I've always thought of you, Martin, as a bit of an entrepreneur, kind of serial entrepreneur. You kind of someone with a low boredom threshold, who kind of always kind of listening to God, wanting to take the next thing on and try out new things. And I think along the way, you set up something called the Aspiration Trust. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. In my time with YFC, we rented accommodation from various different places and had to move too often, and every move was difficult for us. And so I'd spent some time kind of praying into somewhere that could be a permanent home for YFC. And I'd been around looking at various buildings and nothing had come up, and I'd let it go. But God had given me a vision. It was a vision of a house. It looked like a house, and there were lots of different organizations working from the house and sharing stuff and kind of operating in that way. So kingdom focused organizations all working together under a single roof. And looked for it for probably 6 months, didn't find it. I suppose, to be honest, gave up. And there was other things to be pursuing, so gave up. Every time I went to look for one of these buildings, I drove past the derelict church in Wallasey, but never put any thought into it. It was St. Luke's Church in Wallasey. It was an incredible building, but never gave it any thought. I've almost preempted the end of the story here. Mark Mitchell, from Mitchell Motors has got a charity called the Zoom Trust. And Mark was one of our trustees at YFC, and he too had been kind of helping us look for a building. Mark had been incredibly generous to us over the years and was incredibly generous again. He'd had a conversation with Bishop Keith Sinclair, the Bishop of Birkenhead, who mentioned that this building was potentially available. And so it's a building I'd driven past lots of times, and it was becoming a bit of an eyesore, to be honest. It was obviously a church building, but it just wasn't conveying anything of the glory of God to the community in which it was based. It shouldn't have been an eyesore, and it was. And there was all sorts of stories about it being demolished or whatever. And to cut a long story short, the Bishop of Birkenhead offered us it, and there was Mark and I chatted about it. We went to see it, and we just really felt strongly that God was calling us to have it, basically to buy it. And there was a specific amount of money that was needed. There was a building, and then there was some land, and I knew that if I was getting the building, I wanted the land as well, because I wanted to make sure we had access to it. And I thought if we got the land now and it was cheap, we might be able to use it in the future for some other purposes. And so ultimately we ended up purchasing this building and turning it into something incredible with the help of the community. So Mark Johnson, some people may know from Pensby, he'd run Pioneer People, Pensby, out of the Pioneer network of churches. He seconded him in, and he essentially set about turning this derelict space into an incredible community centre that's now 3 churches using it. There's a community cafe, there's office space, various different groups in the community use it. And it's again just kind of honouring God. So I think what it is God plants these mad ideas and with faith. And I think because of those early experiences of God coming through, when God promises something, you can be absolutely assured of the fact that if you just are obedient to the call, he will do what it takes to make it happen.
Sounds a fantastic adventure, and I love the fact that the way you describe it was, I had this idea, felt it was from God, kept looking, but couldn't find anything, and pretty much gave up on it. And I just that resonates with so many other stories I've heard over the years, that, there's an initial, excitement and a vision, and often that dies before it then comes back to life with the life of God underneath it and causing that resurrection of hope and vision for something to happen. And it seems to me that this is a good example of that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
So, okay, Youth for Christ for 10 years, was it? 10, 11 years?
No, 12, 13. Yeah.
Okay. And Safe Families, what was the transition there, and how did that happen? And tell us what Safe Families is.
I'll tell you the journey, and I'll tell you what Safe Families was then and what it's become now. I think that's probably the easiest way to describe it. In 2014, Joe and I, Youth for Christ wasn't just mine, it was something that Joe and I did together. Joe, my wife, was always part of both of us. I mean, I worked full time, but Joe invested a huge amount into it as well, and I'm massively grateful to her. We both felt in early 2014 that God was calling us away from it, and there was a sense of grieving in that, because it was like our baby. We built it into something we had over 40 little projects running, they're all doing their own little things, and we had a good number of staff and lots of volunteers. And now God was calling us away, and we got this building. We'd found this permanent home, and now it wasn't mine to have. I wasn't permanent in it anymore. It was just, what are you doing, Lord? And that caused great confusion, but it was absolutely right, and it was of God. So we prayed into it. I went to see our trustees, and in September I formally resigned and gave my notice. And YFC had asked me to work until December, so we could find somebody else. And so I didn't know what was next.
That was a big step of faith then.
It didn't feel like it though. This is because of that. I'd seen God come through so many times as a child and right through the history of YFC. I knew that if he was calling me out, it didn't feel like a step of faith. It just felt like was just the next chapter. And people were like, this is crazy. You got a wife and there was 2 kids. This is madness. What are you doing? You've got a mortgage. It didn't feel like any of that. It didn't feel madness. It just felt like why wouldn't I? It's more risky to stay than to leave.
Yeah,
because God's called me out. It's like the risk is staying, not leaving. Anyway, so I handed in my resignation, and YFC asked me to work for 6 months. And we got down to I wanted to absolutely honour them and make sure that we had the next person in place. But I knew what the calling was, and I knew it was right to step out. So we kind of toyed with that, really. Stepped out, didn't know what was next. My last pay with Youth for Christ was going to be kind of mid-December. We were always paid early before Christmas, something we put in place. So kind of second week in December, we're about to receive the last paycheck, and whilst it was easy to have the step of faith in September when it felt like a long way, December I was like, did I really hear from God? Is this really right?
Yeah,
because like this is it now. This is where God must come through. We had no savings whatsoever. This is where God must come through. And on the evening of I think it was the 14th of December, I was invited to meet somebody in Liverpool. A friend of a friend is in Liverpool, and he's setting something up, and I think he'd be interested to hear about it. So I went, and it turned out it was Keith Danby, the chief exec of what was Safe Families for Children at the time. And after 15 minutes, he said, "You want to come work for us?" It sounds interesting. I'd had a promise actually in the April. This is significant. I'd forgotten this. I spoke at King's Church over in Bootleway, is it? Dave Elm's church. It was a
Kingsway.
I'd spoken at Kingsway, and somebody had come up at the end with a little piece of paper, and it said, I've got it downstairs. You've got Abrahamic calling on your life. It's time to step out of what you know into what you don't know. And because you'll be obedient, you'll reap children. And I'd had that in my pocket driving home from that kind of event, and I'd kept it. And so we get to this moment, and then there's this charity that's all about working with children, basically offering me a job after a 15-minute conversation. He said, "There's one problem. You can't have any notice period because it's government funded. I need you to start 1st of January. So if you start, you're starting now." Absolutely no problem at all, because I've just worked 3 months' notice. And he said, "Well, why is she happy for you to leave?" I said, "Well, ideally, I would have liked to have done some more time." He said, "Well, I tell you what, then, you can phase into us and phase out of them. We'll pay you full time, but you can work for YFC for basically work 4 days for them, 1 for us, and over the course of 3 months, tier out of one into the other on our pay."
Wow.
So I basically left YFC with 3 months of my salary, but was still able to work those 3 months for them.
Wonderful.
While Safe Families covered my costs. It was just incredible. You couldn't make it up.
And you were asked to basically set up Safe Families in the Northwest, weren't you? Which had only really been piloted in the Northeast up until that point. Is that correct?
I was part of a team who were doing that. Yeah, it wasn't solely on me to do that. Safe Families had been founded in the Northeast. So Peter Vardy had set it up. He was involved in Young Offenders Institutes and trying to help young people who were in Young Offenders Institutes come out and live successful lives. Every time he kind of got into it, he discovered that there was this line that was said to him that young people don't leave Young Offenders Institutes. They leave, they go round the roundabout, and they come straight back in. And if they don't come into here, they end up in the adult population. And when they started to look into it, what they discovered is that kind of 80% of the young people in those institutions have been through the care system. And then starting to do some more kind of digging around. Lots of people who are in the sex industry have been through the care system. Lots of people in various different unemployment. Lots of, I think it was suicide. Lots of these different situations in society, lots of the people in those situations have been through the care system. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some fantastic examples of children who have been looked after by the local authority or been fostered and adopted by incredible people who've really looked after them and transformed their lives for good. But lots of people, that's not their situation. And there's an understanding nationally from government down that the care system can break people and is fundamentally broken. And Peter wanted to do something about this, and so we started to look into it. How can we have an impact on the care system? And how can we help the church do that? We went all around the world and discovered this organisation called Safe Families for Children, which had been founded in the United States by a doctor associate doctor of sociology who'd worked for the local authority in California, in Chicago. Primarily, his role was working to prosecute families who abused or neglected their children. Wanted to think of a better way of doing it. If we can just support those families before that neglect or abuse really starts to happen, we might be able to change the trajectory. And how can we use the church to do that? So that's what he'd set up. So Peter brought it back to the UK, invested his own money into it, and it was hugely successful in the Northeast. And then the Department for Education had committed to giving Safe Families £2.3 million to roll it out into new pilot areas, and one of the pilot areas was Merseyside.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
So you were involved in helping to set that up in Merseyside, and obviously I'm very aware of that because of Jenny, my wife, working for you and with you for 5 years in that, and considers it a huge privilege to have done so. Martin, loved working with you, loved working with Safe Families.
Yeah,
thinks of it very, very fondly, and still volunteers with Safe Families today. So we just fast forward a few years. Obviously, the whole thing has developed. Just give us a quick snapshot. Any statistics on how many sort of children or families have been supported through Safe Families since since they started, or in the local area, whichever you can put your hand to?
Yeah. So we work with over 5,000 faith-based volunteers from churches. What we do is, I'll give you the statistic here after in a moment. We work with churches to empower church members to support members of the community that churches want to support anyway. So it's not like a ministry that comes in and says, give us all your volunteers to come and achieve what we want to achieve. We start a relationship with the church, and wherever churches have a particular desire to support children and families, we mobilise through the expertise we've built up. Families who volunteers, train them and support them with professional staff, so that they can get on with the business of loving the families in their communities. So we deal with all the hard parts to just get the volunteer from the churches to just get on with it. So there's over 5,000 of those, representing over 1,000 churches, and we've supported over 17,000 children now, which is it's incredible. I say churches have done that with our support. And so we're working with over 45 local authorities. We form contractual agreements with authorities. And effectively, the local authorities support us to support families that are referred to them. So they basically
amazing,
allow us to work with those families.
And have the role of Director of Church Relationships. What's that about?
I was a Programme Director for the Northwest. So I strategically led all of our work in the Northwest of England. In 2019, I and our chief exec started to have some conversations around the way we were working with churches. When we formed the local authority contracts, it slightly changed the way we had to work, because suddenly we had contracts to fulfill, and that meant we needed to get enough volunteers to fulfill those contracts. And it just slightly changed the way that we were working, and we really wanted to get back to the roots of empowering churches. So I wrote a job description for a Director of Church Relationships, the role I've got. And what that was about was really strategically reviewing the way we were working with churches now, and then coming up with a strategy that honoured our vision and values, achieved our operational purposes, but was ultimately about empowering churches to make an impact and make the impact they wanted to make. And so I began to write the strategy, and put the job description together, and we decided that was the right thing to do, that God was really calling us to review and reframe our work with churches. Specifically, I chose the title Director of Relationships. So there's some organisations have Director of Church Partnerships or Director of Church Engagements. I specifically didn't want that. I wanted it to be focused on building relationships with churches and understanding what churches themselves wanted to achieve in their communities. And then how can we, if we can, and if we can't, that's fine, we won't, but if we can, help churches achieve their vision with what we've got in our hand.
That's brilliant.
And it's radically transformed the way we work with churches, and we've seen incredible fruit from it.
Yeah, and our own church has benefited hugely from that, Martin, with the guys here who are working with Safe Families. It's been fantastic. So for any leader who's listening to this, who's thinking, oh, I'd love to find out more about that, or explore a relationship with Safe Families, and how would they do that? Who would they contact, and what address would they go to?
The best way to do it is go online, because we've got there's lots of us now, so there's over 160 staff. So pinpointing now where people go is quite difficult. Safefamilies.uk online, and that's got a map on there. And by clicking on the map, you're able to find the right people in the right place to speak to.
Okay, safefamilies.uk.
Yeah,
that's nice and easy. Brilliant. Now, church partnerships is a very natural connection here with Together for the Harvest, which is all about helping churches work together and leaders getting to know and support each other. You've been a big champion of Together for the Harvest over the years. You've been on the board, you've been the chair for a number of years. What was it about Together for the Harvest that drew you to want to be involved in that, Martin?
There's that analogy, isn't it, about when a coal's taken out the fireplace and left to kind of burn on its own, it goes out, but when it's together with other coals, it continues to burn bright. That's certainly part of what TFH kind of inspired me with. There was a network of like-minded, passionate people of faith who primarily led churches and wanted to empower those churches for missional activity. So the united missional outlook. So whatever else they were and whatever else they were doing, there was part of them and part of their culture that was committed to working together for the sake of the kingdom. And TFH provided the umbrella for that. And I found that deeply inspirational. John Manuel was chairing Together for the Harvest when I joined, and he invited me because of the work I'd done with Youth for Christ. I was still with Youth for Christ at the time. I didn't come, looking back, I didn't come to bring anything because I thought I had nothing to bring. I came because there was an opportunity for me to sit in the board and listen to people like Nick Harding and John Kavanagh and Tanny and John Manuel and Dave Elms and others, Steve. There was a gang of these incredible leaders that I looked up to, names that we knew from churches across the region. And John was inviting me to come and sit in a room with him and just learn. And you'll remember, Nick, for weeks I just sat and soaked it up. It was so inspiring to me to just hear you guys talk and chat through some of the complexities and how you return in the vision that you shared together, and even some of the stuff that you didn't agree on, how that was played out and dealt with and talked about with but always with the desire of kind of honouring God and seeing the kingdom come. What a privilege.
And we really benefited too from your input, Martin. Grateful for the years that you gave to us.
Yeah, thank you.
And the vision remains the same, which is to see every man, woman, and child reached with the gospel, so that we can see our city region saturated and transformed by the gospel. Yeah. And you've played a huge part of that, as does Youth for Christ, as does Safe Families. All of these ministry organizations all play into that. And we always want to connect with new churches, new leaders, new ministry organizations to say, how can we do this better together? What could God do through all of us working together? He couldn't do through any one of us. And just want to thank you for the part you've played in that and continue to encourage us in. Martin, we're almost at the end. We're running out of time. So I just need to land this one by asking you a really important question. You've given us some great stories of faith and inspired us about how, growing in faith, taking steps of faith, the obedience of faith, and God coming through. What about leadership? A lot of the people who are listening to this are in leadership of one form or another. What would you say that you've either learned about leadership or would want to encourage people who are in leadership in? What would the last things you'd want to say be?
Four things probably. I think I've learned along the way that if you get four things right, you're going in the right direction. I think getting your values right is essential at the start. So know who and what you are. I think in all of the places where I've seen success, it's because we've got the values right at the start. People say start with why. It's the Simon Sinek stuff, and that he took from Viktor Frankl and other places. You start with your why, and I agree with that. But your vision. But I think you start with your values first. Know who and what you are, and allow that to shape everything. And that can be hard to do. But I would encourage any leader to consider the values first, who and what we are. Then vision, know what you're about. Just be really clear what it is you want to see happen. And that's where the why comes in. Know what it is you're about. We often start with kind of how and what we're going to do. Know why you're doing it. Get your vision right. Values, vision, and then it's about setting the right culture to achieve that vision alongside those values. And again, that takes a huge amount of time. Our culture in Safe Families now, it was when we started, it was right for then, but it wasn't right for now. And there's a different culture now in Safe Families that's taken a long time to get right, but it's been a difficult journey, but it's been absolutely the right journey. Forgive me for the phone beeping. Values, vision, culture, and then get the processes right to allow you to achieve those things. That's a shorthand answer to a big question. But whenever I've been involved in an organisation that's done those four things well, that's where we've seen great success.
Brilliant.
So,
Martin, thank you so much. And even in just those small little nuggets at the end there, I know we could spend an hour unpacking those and a lot more unpacking those four things. But thank you, Martin, so much for being with us today. Thank you for inspiring us with your story and encouraging us in what God's called each of us to do in our own particular areas and responsibilities. So, Martin, could we just finish by you praying for those who are going to be listening to this and those who are in leadership across the city region?
Yeah, will do. Yeah, let me pray. Father, we thank you for what you've already promised to do with our region. God, there are amazing things you're yet to do in our region. God, there's the privilege and the terrifying reality is you're going to use our hands to achieve those things. God, for all those who are on that journey, for all those who have both the privilege and I suppose a burden to work with you in this transformation that we long to see. God, I pray for them, God. I just pray for a real sense of clear vision for them. God, I pray, it's been hard, God, hasn't it? It's been hard for church leaders. God, I pray for just a refreshing for them. God, we often pray for a fresh touch of the Spirit. I'm not convinced about that, God. I just pray you would remind us of the Spirit that's already at work in us. There is no fresh touch, God. The Spirit is strong and you are good. So, God, I just pray that we would have opportunities to recognize the fact that you are sovereign over this region and your will and desire for this region and the part we play in it is glorious. God, and I pray you just give us some fresh insight into that and what that looks like. Yeah. Amen.
Amen. Martin Dickson, the legend. Thank you so much, and appreciate all that you've contributed today into this leadership conversation. Every blessing.
Bless you, Nick. Thank you.